unpredictable world. I mean, it's the ultimate question that keeps investors awake at night, right? How do you keep your capital safe when the ground underneath the global economy feels like it's constantly shifting? The stakes of navigating today's macroeconomic realities have literally never been higher, and traditional methods of diversifying, they simply aren't enough anymore to shield a portfolio from genuine structural shocks. We need a completely different framework. To understand the solution, we kind of have to acknowledge the chaos first. Just look at the physical vulnerabilities of our global supply chains right now. For instance, roughly 20% of the entire world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That is a highly contested 21-mile geographic choke point where any conflict instantly disrupts global energy markets. Add to that our domestic macroeconomic shifts. With Kevin Warsh poised to take over the Federal Reserve, we are looking at massive potential shifts in monetary policy, including a drastic reduction of the Fed's balance sheet. When you combine those geopolitical constraints with persistent inflation and shifting central bank policies, well, you get a recipe for extreme external volatility. But external chaos is really only half the battle. Let's talk about internal human error. Frankly, our own brains are often our absolute worst enemies when it comes to compounding wealth. Behavioral economists call this myopic loss aversion. It's this deeply ingrained psychological trap where we actually feel the pain of a loss twice as intensely as the joy of an equivalent gain. Because of this human flaw, investors who actually have an infinite, multi-decade time horizon end up evaluating their portfolios on irrationally short quarter-to-quarter timeframes. They panic, they hug benchmarks, and ultimately, they destroy their own long-term wealth. Which brings us to another super dangerous psychological trap, anchoring, projecting the recent past into the infinite future. When external shocks hit, investors naturally tend to anchor to the recent difficulties. They project a bad quarter or a tough macro environment endlessly into the future. They completely ignore the natural competitive forces of the market that usually cause things to revert to the mean. Capital naturally leaves depressed areas and flows to high-returning ones. But by anchoring to the present panic, investors penalize themselves. So, if macro shocks are entirely unpredictable and our own psychology is so inherently flawed, what is the ultimate defense mechanism? The answer lies in the companies themselves. Warren Buffett absolutely hit the nail on the head when he said, the single most important decision in evaluating a business is pricing power. If you've got the power to raise prices without losing business to a competitor, you've got a very good business. This right here is the ultimate shield against both macroeconomic chaos and human panic. If a company controls its pricing, it controls its own destiny, completely independent of whatever is happening in the Strait of Hormuz or over at the Federal Reserve. And it's fascinating because we can see this exact dynamic playing out in real time. Looking at the data tracking corporate earnings calls, notice how whenever mentions of inflation spike, mentions of pricing power surge right alongside it. When costs go up, the corporate world desperately scrambles to assure investors that, hey, they have the power to pass those costs on to the consumer. But as we all know, talking about pricing power and actually having it are two very different things. So, to separate the talkers from the doers, quantitative analysts at S&P Global define an economic moat using strict mathematics. They look for three distinct things: sustained high return on invested capital over 5+ years, high market share, and crucially, sustained high gross margins. A high gross margin is the absolute purest mathematical evidence of real pricing power. Why? Because it definitively proves a company can absorb rising input costs without destroying its profitability. Let's look at a real-world example of building a structural moat to protect those margins. Take Apple's silicon. Apple recently moved away from third-party chip makers to design its own internal silicon for Macs and iPhones. On their earnings call, leadership explicitly called this a game changer and a major competitive advantage. By taking total control of their core technology, they didn't just differentiate their product. They took absolute control over their cost roadmap, structurally protecting and even boosting their gross margins against external supply chain shocks. But here's the kicker. It's not just about having high margins. True pricing power equals gross margin stability. Research shows that the most resilient companies are what we call quiet quality compounders. These are often the hard-to-replace suppliers of mission-critical goods. Think consumer staples or highly specialized industrial parts. Their pricing power is mathematically measured by the inverse standard deviation of their gross margins. In plain English, it means their profitability is incredibly, almost boringly predictable over time, literally no matter what inflation is doing out in the real world. Okay, so things like high returns on capital, stable margins, and network effects are fantastic, but they are actually just the byproduct of something much, much deeper, the leadership moat. Traditional moats are about patents and economies of scale, but a leadership moat, that is fundamentally about the people steering the ship. It's about exceptional capital allocation and unwavering long-term focus and having real, tangible skin in the game. So, what exactly makes up the traits of a leadership moat? Well, it's management teams that act like true business owners, not just your run-of-the-mill corporate bureaucrats. They engage in independent, non-consensus thinking. Their incentives are strictly tied to long-term value creation. Their primary focus is always on wealth preservation and avoiding permanent loss. When management treats the company's capital as if it were their own personal bank account, you get capital allocation decisions that consistently compound wealth for decades. 3. Just 3. That is the astonishingly low number of chief executive officers the global beauty behemoth L'Oreal has had in the past 35 years. In an era where the average corporate CEO jumps ship every few years to chase a shiny new stock package, this is an unparalleled metric of management consistency. And as we're going to see, this stability is the absolute bedrock of their immense compounding power. Decades of that kind of consistent, laser-focused leadership produces remarkable results. L'Oreal hasn't diversified into random industries just to chase fleeting trends. They focus purely on beauty. And through masterful capital allocation and brilliant marketing, they've built 11 different brands that each generate over 1 billion euros in annual sales, from CeraVe to La Roche-Posay to Lancôme. Because beauty products are relatively low cost but highly important to consumers, L'Oreal inherently possesses that magical pricing power we were talking about earlier. And this translates directly into hard, undeniable numbers. L'Oreal's compounding success is incredible. They command a 15% global market share in a highly fragmented industry. Their operating return on capital is a staggering 60%. When they acquire a company like they did with CeraVe back in 2017, they don't destroy value. No, they've grown CeraVe's sales 10 times over since buying it. And why do they operate this way? Because the founding family still controls over a third of the stock. They have absolute skin and soul in the game. So the big takeaway here is profound. Great financial numbers are simply the byproduct of excellent management. A truly robust portfolio isn't built by obsessing over the Federal Reserve or panicking over the daily news cycle. It is built by finding companies that are completely in control of their own destiny. When you invest alongside leadership teams that possess a true structural moat, you effectively shield your wealth from external macroeconomic noise. Which brings us right back to you. Will your portfolio weather the next macroeconomic storm, or are you anchored to the past? Take a hard look at your own wealth preservation strategy right now. When the next major supply chain shock hits, or when central bank policies flip the market upside down, are you ready? Or are your investments heavily reliant on a macro environment that simply doesn't exist anymore? Navigating all of this definitely doesn't have to be guesswork. If you want to actually master the long run, visit longruninvest.io. That's longruninvest.io. You can align your capital with the exact types of quiet quality compounders and exceptional leadership moats we've covered today. Take control of your financial destiny, rely on deep research, and let the eighth wonder of the world, compounding, work for you. Ultimately, you have to ask yourself, in a world of constant chaos, who is really steering your ship?